Welcome to the panel, Decolonising Sexualities. It's the panel for the final panel of this conference, Queering Authoritarianisms. Thank you for joining us. So this panel is going to be trying to answer questions like, what does it mean to decolonize sexualities? How can we think about sexualities in a broader history of colonialism, exploitation, and racism? Furthermore, what different practices and ways of producing knowledge can help us better engage with these questions? So we will be discussing in this panel the different ways in which we engage with sexualities, situating them in broader context of colonialism. Okay, so we're gonna start with Kim TallBear. She's at the University of Alberta, and the paper that we're gonna hear is called Settler Love is Breaking My Heart, Sex, Kin, Country. Thank you very much. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Monica. It's good to be here. It's 10 a.m. for me, so I'm not an early riser. So excuse me if I sound like I just got out of bed. This talk originally, it's a part of a forthcoming book project called Disrupting Sex and Nature and Indigenous Relational Logic. I'm sure the press will make that title sexier than it is. But the original talk is 45 minutes, like a normal talk, and it's both has the analytical frameworks that I use and it has field data. But I decided today, because it's a much shorter talk, to just go with the analytical frameworks, but you'll get a sense of what some of the field work is, which is a terrible word for what I'm doing in this book, which is going to be kind of a creative nonfiction, autoethnographically informed book. And I'm writing in more experimental or creative forms, precisely because I don't want to do a traditional ethnography on being in relation, because it involves all kinds of personal relations as well. And so part of the book project is going to be figuring out ethically and methodologically how I talk about these kinds of things without kind of drawing on this kind of typical hierarchical anthropological set of methods. And I talk a lot about that in my first book, Native American DNA, my kind of love-hate relationship with anthropology. And so this book is kind of an effort to move beyond that. So let's see how far I get. And I'm going to turn on my stopwatch here. Okay. So the thinking in this talk began as a personal project that later connected to my academic analyses of settler colonial forms of race and kinship that are embodied in concepts like nature, genes, genomes. So before becoming an academic, I worked as an environmental planner for about 10 years with US federal agencies, tribal governments, and national organizations. I've been in Canada 5.5 years now. So that this work that I'm doing now on non-monogamy, settler sexualities is enabled by this kind of circuitous intellectual path through environmental studies, community planning, and science and technology studies. So the bulk of my academic work, because I'm a second career academic, I didn't start a PhD till 32, has focused on forms of genetic science that construct racial categories as both method and justification for control of populations. So my newer work builds on my longer standing challenges to settler control of Indigenous life by extending my critical lens to the roles of monogamy and hetero and homonormative dyadic marriage. And that's what's going to be much of the next book. And the use of those forms of sexuality and kinship to assimilate Indigenous peoples and our relations into the North American colonial project. So settler colonialism transforms relations, what we think about as relations, and I'll talk about some of those frameworks, into human-centered, racialized, patriarchal property and properties. And I think a lot about the relationship of property and the inheritance of property and the inheritance of properties, including biological properties. So compulsory monogamy, settler sexuality, and family go hand in hand with discourses of evolution and race. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next book. Compulsory monogamy and marriage facilitates state management of Indigenous and other human bodies. And it facilitates management of the land. Settler sexualities and their unsustainable kin forms do not only harm humans, they don't only harm Indigenous people, they harm all of us. They also harm the earth. So I consider how Indigenous relational frameworks, including with more than humans, can help prompt sustainable and just relations for more than just Indigenous people. So I'll talk about environmental things in my work, but I also talk about the way that unsustainable emotional and family and kinship formations they're not only emotionally unsustainable, they're also environmentally unsustainable. So I'm just going to give you a definition of settler sexuality. I don't know in this audience how many people are familiar with this kind of North American settler colonial terminology. So Canadian queer theorist Scott Morgenson, he's at Queen's University in Ontario, defines settler sexuality as, quote, the heteropatriarchal and sexual modernity exemplary of white settler civilization, unquote. So he elaborates as well that settler sexuality is a white national heteronormativity and increasingly also homonormativity that regulates Indigenous sexuality and gender by supplanting them with the sexual modernity of settler subjects. Settler states like the US and Canada have not only imposed settler sexuality and family onto Indigenous peoples, private property and nuclear family also foreclosed better relating with both humans and more than humans that settlers and other newcomers encountered on these continents. So it's been imposed onto all of us. Compulsory monogamy, along with compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory marriage tied to private property, have been central to settler colonialism in the US and Canada, and its imposition of non-Indigenous forms of sex and family tied to land tenure in Indigenous studies in North America, and I think globally as well. We're very quick to go after land tenure, notions of biological race and blood quantum and the manifestation of those things in contemporary Indigenous social formations, but we don't nearly go after marriage and monogamy as much as we should, I think. And though those formations were inherently tied up with the transition from communal property to private land tenure in these settler states. So the longer version of this talk has a section on how the non/monogamy system, to use Angela Willey's term in her book Undoing Monogamy, how that system plays into evolving forms of settler colonial sex and kinship. But in this brief talk, I'm just going to focus on the relational analytics. My analyses of various forms of consensual non-monogamy and my analyses that unsettle what I call settler marriage have helped me focus on a fuller spectrum of relations among both humans and non-humans in my work, and on actually decentering the related objects called sex and nature in order to help dismantle hierarchies among all our relations. So coming into this non-monogamy work has taken me back in a sense to the environmental work. And I could put scare quotes all over this talk, but I'll give you a sense of how these objects should be interrogated. So the next section of the talk is called Disaggregating Sex and Spirit, Reaggregating Relations. Nature could be in there as well. So the three objects I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes are sex, spirit, and nature. How I want to think about pulling those apart and reaggregating relations. So in my so-called sexualities work, I center Indigenous studies, relational and feminist frameworks that I put into conversation with science studies frameworks. Together, these help unsettle settler thought. So for one thing, I think a lot with David Delgado Shorter, who is in Indigenous studies, although he does not identify as Indigenous, also was a fellow History of Consciousness grad student, finished before me. But so we think a lot together. I came to know his work long after I attended graduate school. So he's working at the intersection, he's at UCLA, of Indigenous studies, religious studies, and anthropology to explain Indigenous relational frameworks that can help us conceptually and pragmatically disaggregate social and scientific objects, sex, nature, spirit, into webs of relation. So settler colonial thought produces these objects for the purposes of control and management of humans and more than humans who have been considered as less agential or less animate, as lower on a hierarchy of life. So disrupting these objects of sex, nature, and spirit is therefore, I think, in and of itself anti-colonial, particularly if we're using Indigenous relational frameworks. So in his essay entitled very simply Sexuality, Shorter discusses seers and healers among the Yoeme. So I'm going to give you an example of how this works. The Yoeme are an indigenous people on both sides of the now Mexico-US border. Shorter originally set out to understand the spiritual aspects of what Morea Kamem, or healers within that community, do. And he also has a related essay entitled Spirituality that reflects an analytical relationship between those two objects, sex and spirit. So an elder in southern Yoeme on the Mexico side of the border told Shorter that individuals who engage in non-monogamous and or non-heterosexual relationships are also often healers, or Morea Kamem. But Shorter stayed focused in that essay on the overarching idea of Morea Kamem as relating. He described the healer's reciprocity with the power they receive in encounters with spirits and ancestors, with dreams, with animals. And he also described Morea Kamem relations and power exchanges within the human realm, when the healers use their power to see for and heal other humans who are suffering from various afflictions of mind and body. So Shorter did not ask about the details of Morea Kamem's sexuality. He emphasized instead relations and exchange, and resisted objectifying Morea Kamem's sexuality as, say, gay or straight. I'm also really interested in what such a relational focus would reveal in the practices of relating of many other cultures who have been subject to Eurocentric or Western colonialism and its attendant cultural evangelizing in the areas of spirituality, sexuality, and nature. And I will be looking at some of these other kind of cultural practices in the next year of doing work on this book. So Shorter explains that Morea Kamem don't accentuate their personal characteristics and capacities. For example, their sexuality or their power to heal. Instead, Morea Kamem focus on their practices in community as they, quote, work tirelessly and selflessly to maintain right relations. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about a term Shorter uses called objectivating the intersubjective. And I make my undergrads write about this every semester, and they get it by the end. So in a settler colonial frame, we are accustomed to thinking of spirit, spirituality, sexuality, or sex as things, not as relations or connected points on a web. Within a settler ontological lens, Morea Kamem become a class of person defined along either sexual and or spiritual lines. But in describing how relations or the relational sharing of power become things in a non-UMA framework, Shorter uses this term objectivating the intersubjective. In the spirituality essay, he explains that intersubjective, like related, emphasizes mutual connectivity, shared responsibility, and interdependent well-being. Now, within a Morea Kamem context, sexuality and spirituality can be seen both as constituted of human relational activities. They are sets of relations through which power is acquired and exchanged in reciprocal fashion between persons, not all of whom are human. Shorter explains, and I'm going to quote at length here for a minute. In many tribal communities, we must recognize that people are individuals more than individuals. All being is relational. It would follow then that we would need to seek an understanding of Indigenous sexualities that recognizes sexuality not as a thing or object that is constituted once and unchanging. Rather, sexuality might prove to be a relating, a sharing of power, reconstituted over and over based on the intersubjective dynamism of two or more persons. Seen this way, sexuality would then appear as a way of being that which directly and intentionally mediates social relations across the family, the clan, pueblo, tribe, and other forms of relations, including other than human persons. Sexuality starts looking in this context more like a type of power, particularly one capable of healing. Approaching sexuality studies in a way that de-objectifies sexuality, that sees sexuality as a mode of relating, is one of a series of theoretical postulates we must wrestle with in Indigenous studies scholarship. And I'm just going to say as an aside, my students this week in my Indigenous Technoscience course read a paper out of Jason Edward Lewis's Indigenous Futures Lab out of Concordia in Montreal called Making Kin with Machines, looking at AI and the way that Indigenous frameworks can be applied to relating to AI. And there's a lot to think about in sexuality studies around AI. I'm sure some of you in the audience are engaged in this already, because even though it's not often said explicitly by the developers of AI, one of the main things they're going to be used for is sexual services. So we really need to think about more ethical ways of relating, quote unquote, sexually. And I think that Shorter's work about de-objectifying things back into relations, this kind of theoretical framework is really important for thinking about that. So back to the Morea comment, understanding their relationality and community helps us to understand both their so-called sexuality and spirituality, and ours too, as acts of reciprocity and power exchange. One can also begin to see how a relational circulation of healing power is not compatible with the categorical and property imperatives of settler sex and marriage. Neither is a relational analysis compatible with the idea of indigenizing sexuality. Rather, we might consider that the goal is to disaggregate so-called sexuality, not back to tradition, not forward into progress, but back into, and back out into a web of relations. That is a web or a net in which relations exchange power, and power is intention, thus holding the web or community together. I only have a few minutes, so I think let's talk about nature as relations for a minute. After Shorter's analysis, we might think of not only sex and spirit, but also nature as not a thing at all, but also as sets of relations in which power circulates. Again, prior to dipping my toes into the topical waters of sexuality studies, much of my work addressed nature, both human and more than human nature. So I also focus on various forms of nature in my own analyses of relations objectified. In analyses of, say, genomic and environmental phenomena, I keep in mind as well the circulation of power, which might be otherwise described as material or energetic sustenance embodied in flesh, other organismic material, in stone, or in other earthly elements. So you can begin to see how relating sexually, as we call it in English, might not be all that different if we're taking a power and circulatory and relational framework in terms of the way that we're relating with, say, stone. I wrote a paper as well about the relations of Indigenous peoples with pipestone. That's the town that I was born in. Pipestone quarries are where ceremonial pipes, or peace pipes, as they're mistakenly known in English, get called. There's a lot of ways of relating with stone, with earthly elements, that are really important to consider when we're thinking about exchanges of power. When we're thinking about how materiality is consumed, how it's conjoined with, how it's harvested for other forms of relating, say the weaving of baskets or the making of canoes, the carving of those ceremonial pipes. And the circulation of power and material forms of sustenance, I ask, after Shorter, if we might resist objectivating the intersubjective. Might we resist hardening relations into objects that enable the control and management of us? Maybe, for example, a ceremonial pipe or a basket, like sex, is not an object at all, not an artifact at all, but it is a form of a co-constitution of both materiality and life force, of human and other than humans. So there's a lot conceptually and ethically at stake in our resistance to these key objectifications, sex, spirit, nature, that we are dished out by settler colonial culture. And there's also a lot pragmatically at stake. Relational frames that help de-objectify spirituality, sexuality, and nature might help humans be more attuned to relating carefully and robustly in practice as we consider the reverberations of our movements across our webs of relations. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. Actually, you still had 3 minutes and 45, so that's great. Thank you so much. You did an amazing job.
I'm sorry, my clock says 15:27, so.
That's great.
Oh, we were gonna go to 20. No, but I'm happy to finish early because this gives more time. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I'm gonna give now the word to Ayodele Sogunro. I hope I'm saying it right, your surname, Ayodele. Human rights lawyer, writer, and PhD candidate of the University of Pretoria from South Africa. And the paper we're going to hear is The Nature and Legacy of Political Homophobia in British Colonial Africa, the Nigerian Case. So I'll put you around as well 20 minutes, but if you do less, that's absolutely fine. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Permit me to adopt Kim's caveat and note that this is part of a wider chapter from my recently concluded PhD thesis, which traces the evolution of laws criminalizing queer sexualities in Nigeria from about 1960 1900 up to 2015. However, my discussion today is focused on the evolution of criminalizing laws in the colonial period, that's from 1900 to 1960. Essentially, I argue that the criminalization of queer sexuality is part of wider social control that is aimed at perpetuating hegemonic power for the socioeconomic benefit of the political elite. And for this purpose, I rely a lot on the theory of political homophobia. I believe that this theory is useful in re-engaging the issue of decolonizing sexualities and relitigating the continuing impact of colonialism in African societies. This examination is undertaken with the intent of showing how political homophobia, through laws that delineated and criminalized transgressive sexualities, was in fact a strategic and pragmatic political tool rather than merely an ideological one. And it was utilized under the colonial administration to protect colonial interests and also maintain the legitimacy of colonization. So the outcome of this process and the incentive of that process also was the social exclusion of a large majority of the colonized population for the benefit of an elite class of colonial administrators specifically, and the benefit of the white race in general. And I argue that if we understand the rationale behind the colonial evolution of the legacy laws we have in Nigeria and similar legal systems in Africa, it can provide an insight into the continuing use of political homophobia by contemporary political actors in this system. And so to conceptualize political homophobia, I borrow from the work of Weiss and Bossia, as well as Serrano Amaya, to define political homophobia as the conscious use of homophobia as a political strategy, often unrelated to substantial local demands for political rights. And it can also be viewed as the use of homosexuality to produce fear for political purposes. So Weiss and Bossia suggest that political homophobia is utilized as a tool for constructing or reinforcing authoritative notions of a national collective identity. It is used for preventing alternative identities that may oppose this national collective identity, whether or not such other identities even relate to sexuality. And it's used, of course, for mobilizing around contentious issues. And Bossia goes further. He suggests that there are three interconnecting frameworks for researching homophobia, political homophobia. You can look at it as a tool by state actors for reconstituting belongings in periods of transition, as a tool for affirming political rule when state actors are threatened by competition, and as a tool for organizing strategic alliances to build state capacity and scapegoat LGBT people within a Western sexual binary. And following up on this research, Ashley Correa identifies two ways in which political homophobia may be useful to state leaders. It can be used as a way to silence dissent. It allows leaders to deflect attention away from critical and sensitive issues. And it allows the rewriting of history from the perspective of the ruling party. So essentially, when we understand political homophobia and its relevance to the construction of transgressive sexualities, we can begin to see that this challenges the rhetoric that is often used by state actors, especially in the context where I come from, Nigeria, that the laws regulating sexuality are merely an expression of popular will. And it also shifts focus from the merely legal aspects of criminalization to the underlying political subtext. And more importantly, it also identifies the linkages between homophobia and the political goal of controlling the state's authority. So while these laws that criminalize same-sex relationships in Nigeria may seem to have been products of clinical and disinterested legislative processes, they are in fact political products that are shaped by the politics and legacy of colonialism, as Letkov knows, and the desire by successive elite groups to control state power throughout the course of Nigeria's history. But before I go into all that, let me give a quick historical background. The entity we now call the Federal Republic of Nigeria originated as an administrative amalgamation of several communities, a process first started by the trading entity known as the Royal Niger Company, and then later by the British government. The British government initially administered the territories as separate colonies and protectorates, and then ultimately as one country. The societies and communities that would later become known as Nigeria had their own legal system, including their own criminal laws. And for a while, this remained unaltered after the British arrived in the early 1800s. However, in 1863, a newly established colonial government introduced the English common law into the southern coastal kingdom of Eko, but by then was already being called Lagos. So this legal system introduced into Lagos would eventually form the kernel of Nigeria's legal system as the administration and legal system evolved over the next 100 years. Now, in 1904, having secured British military control north of the River Niger, Frederick Lugard proclaimed a criminal code to aid British administration over the entire territory. This code was modeled on an 1899 version that was then in use in the Queensland colony of Australia. And curiously, this Queensland code was itself based on a draft code that had been rejected in 1878 in Britain. So essentially, the codes that the English denied themselves, they gave it largesse to their colonies and dependencies, to quote Michael and Westler. In 1959, a year before Nigeria's independence, a separate penal code was enacted for northern Nigeria. This was also modeled on one which was in use in Sudan at the time. And the one in Sudan in turn was modeled on an 1860 penal code drafted for India by Lord Macaulay. So after Nigeria's independence from the British in 1960, these two codes, the criminal code that was earlier introduced and the penal code that came in later, one for the south, one for the north, they continue to govern criminal justice administration across the country up to this day. And despite these variations in the penal and criminal code, it is important that I emphasize that they have the common origin, employ the same concept, and are governed by the same philosophical considerations. In essence, the entire legal framework criminalizing same-sex relationships and non-conforming gender identities in Nigeria were first introduced in 1914, and then they have been adopted and continue to be used in today, and they can be found in sections 214 to 2017 of the Criminal Code and sections 284 and 405 of the Penal Code. So with that background out of the way, I argue that the deliberate and unilateral inclusion of provisions that criminalize queer sexualities by the British colonial government is a demonstration of what Bossy and West called a conscious political strategy, often unrelated to substantial local demands for political rights. And it is important to critically examine the ways in which these laws constituted a philosophy of political homophobia, and how this philosophy strategically favored the political and economic interests of the colonial project across all of the British Empire. So for this purpose, we can look at the context of political homophobia in the colonial states from two perspectives. One, we can look at political homophobia in the origins of homophobic laws in England until their codification in the Queensland Code and its offshoot. And then we can look at political homophobia in the process and reasons for introducing these codes in the territories like Nigeria. Now, regarding the first perspective, it is useful to trace the origins of homophobia from the hegemonic politics of England all the way to the codification in their territories. And the first occurrence of a law criminalizing same-sex relationships in England was in 1533, under the reign of King Henry VIII, who instituted the offense of burglary, punishable by hanging at the time. The year that this legislation was passed was not happenstance. In 1533, King Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn against the directives of the Pope. And in 1534, he declared himself the head of the Church of England. And so you can see that the direct criminalization of homosexuality by the English Parliament at the time coincided with the political struggles between the English monarch and the papacy, with the English Parliament limiting the jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical church, and in this way demonstrating the political motivation behind the use of homophobia. Strategically, the English monarch was able to make accusations of homosexuality against the monks in the Papal monastery as a pretext for seizing their lands and assets. And within a few years, the monasteries were dissolved, their wealth was transferred to Henry and the nobles who had supported him. These actions were carried out without any criminal trial. And in fact, the only documented criminal trial on the issue of homosexuality, which was the trial and conviction of Lord Hungerford, was actually staged in his political affiliations rather than his sexuality. So the introduction of these laws criminalizing same-sex relationships in England was deeply connected to a morality intended to sustain the political and economic interests of the English monarchy. And the theological question of whether or not priests should be able to marry, which was a key issue between the Catholics and the Protestants, was framed around homosexuality through political propaganda, with Catholic monks constantly being accused of being sodomites. When the Catholics were temporarily restored to political favor in 1553 under the reign of Queen Mary, the Burghley Law was repealed, but it was again reinstated in 1564 after Queen Elizabeth I, who was a Protestant, came to power. The reinstated statutes with an amendment of the sentence from death by hanging to life imprisonment would then go on to stay in the English statute books until eventually repealed in 1967. But more importantly for this conversation, that 1564 statute influenced the codification of homophobia into the criminal laws of British colonies, starting with the Queensland Code in Australia and ultimately the criminal and penal codes of societies like Nigeria. So the use of legislation to enforce political homophobia secured or reinforced the Protestant Christian values that secured the interests of the monarchy, creating a hegemonic ideal in quotes, that guided the notion of a dutiful citizen of the English crown. And under this ideal, there was a natural, again in quotes, order of things, and acts that did not fit into this so-called natural order were frowned on. The language of the codified homophobic legislation emphasized that same-sex relationships were against the order of nature, or they were put under unnatural offenses. And this understanding that there was a hegemonic ideal or an order of nature continued to guide the beliefs and acts of the traders, the explorers, the missionaries, and the administrators of the British Empire. It informed their attitude to other societies and cultures who are termed savage, primitive, and barbaric. And anyone that did not fit into this worldview was justifiably colonized. And so we come to the second perspective, the process and the reasons for introducing these codes in societies like Nigeria. So much like the use of political homophobia in the conflict between the English monarchy and the papacy, the use of political homophobia also served British interests in the colonial project through what I identify as three interlocking processes. One, by undermining and erasing existing norms and values. Two, introducing British hegemonic ideals to justify British political control. And three, establishing British political control to secure British commercial interests. So, erase existing norms, introduce British norms to justify British control, and establish British control to secure British commercial interests. After the British administration then took control of Lagos in 1862, both the English common law and native laws were initially implemented simultaneously. However, the colonial authorities gradually imported the body of English law, including the common law and doctrines of equity, right, for use in the colony on the grounds that, large numbers of Europeans had arrived in the colony and the local laws were unsuitable for these large-scale commercial activities, or that the Europeans were unwilling to be bound by unwritten and seemingly unascertainable tribal laws. All of these reasons why it's convenient for the colonial administrators did not consider the values and ideals of the indigenes, nor did they accommodate the disapproval of the indigenes. Instead, the colonial government actively undermined the population, particularly, for example, in its attempt to codify the criminal laws, which was a decision that met strong resistance from the inhabitants of Lagos. Nevertheless, the introduction of the criminal code assisted in substituting English values with the existing values of the indigenous people in the colonial state. For the British Empire, the position of English values guaranteed the security of the colonial project. Frederick Lugard, in his now infamous essay, The White Man's Task in Tropical Africa, summarizes this project as a dual mandate for the colonies to act as trustees, on the one hand, for the development of the resources of Africa on behalf of Europe, and on the other hand, they exercise a sacred trust on behalf of the people of Africa and who are so pathetically dependent on their guidance. So their first object was to extract resources for the benefit of Europe, while their second object was to guide the people in this paternalistic fashion. And I would say that to the extent that modern African societies and governments have almost wholly accepted and adopted that guidance, then this objective of the colonial project has been successful. But the point is that Lugar's theory of the dual mandate as the responsibility of colonizers points to the fact that the British colonial government considered itself as a naturally privileged elite tasked with the duty of guiding the colonized people. In the Lagos Colonial, later across all of Nigeria, the relationship between the colonial government and the population was a hierarchical one, and white colonial officers were the ones at the top of the hierarchy. But again, elite privilege was not limited to the colonial administrators. It also encompassed all other Europeans in the territory, actually missionaries, educators, and entrepreneurs. Because of this expanded racially based elitist context, the inclusion of homophobic laws in the criminal code became even more urgent for the colonial administrators. This colonial anxiety is described by Gupta as fears of moral infection from the native environment. As the dual mandate conceptualized by Lugar then implies, the British colonial project and its accompanying legal system were principally directed at securing British political and economic dominion through British access to and control of local resources disguised as moral and political guidance. And if you understand this colonial project as an exploitative one, it necessarily follows that the legal systems that were built around this were principally meant to cater to this goal and not targeted at any kind of social inclusivity or political participation of the people. This is evident not just in the introduction of the homophobic laws to exclude a subset of the community and alienate more tolerant perspectives on sexuality. It's also demonstrated by the wider exclusion of poorer members of the colonized population through the use of vagrancy laws. For example, criminalizing being a vagabond or being an idle and disorderly person. All in the same category of criminalizing identities that do not fit into the hegemonic value of the colonizing powers. In summary, this discussion is to situate the colonial project in Nigeria, just as elsewhere, as one that intentionally sought to establish the power of a racial elite with a clearly defined hegemony that used criminal laws to control, repress, and socially exclude the majority of the population from these imposed systems of governance. Within this machinery of elitism and social exclusion, sexuality in general, homosexuality in particular, were weaponized as areas to perpetuate the savior versus savage narrative. And this process of demonizing African sexuality, while simultaneously hegemonizing European values of the time in Africa, is what Nguyen notes as the power relationships inherent in the normative process of regulating sexuality. One where a hegemonic culture is imposed by the dominant political elite, in this case, the colonial government, and then political power is used to exclude groups whose sexualities are outside the domain of majoritarian and hegemonic culture. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions later.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Ayodele. So now you were just on time, perfect. And now we have our last speaker of this panel, Matthew Waits, based at the University of Glasgow. So nice to see, we go way long back. We haven't met in different moments, so it's great to see you again, Matthew. And the paper we're gonna hear is called Contesting Colonial Criminalization, the Significance of Customary Law for Decolonizing Queer Analysis. So I'll put you 20 minutes, but thank you. We'll be listening. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to say it's a pleasure to be on a panel with both Kim and Ayo, both really interesting papers. Kim, I'm meeting for the first time. Ayo and I have been working together on a project recently, so it's really good to be on a panel with both of you. So the criminalization by some European empires of sexuality between men and sometimes between women has emerged as a major critical concern with persistent legacies. And the British Empire has really emerged as the most guilty party. Criminalisation of same-sex acts persists in 35 of the 54 states in the Commonwealth that emerged from the British Empire. So this paper is providing a discussion of how we might better analyse such criminalisation and its contestation, particularly considering decolonising analyses and with particular attention to the neglected issue of customary law. Now, I want to say at the beginning that I'm conscious of my own positionality and my socially constituted identity as someone based in the UK, someone who's been racialized as white, someone who benefits economically from the history of colonialism. So I'm not claiming to own or straightforwardly offer a decolonising analysis. But what I'm trying to do is to engage with the work of decolonising analysis in some productive ways. So to expand on what I mean by customary law, the form of law known as customary law had a recognised legal status within British colonial governance from the early 20th century, although with variation across territories. Much of the literature, the current literature on customary law, defines it simply as the law of particular peoples. However, for critical analysis, I would argue that customary law may be better conceived as a discourse produced in the colonial encounter through unequal and hierarchical exchanges between colonizers and colonized. Hence, customary law may be best thought of as a concept subtly different from indigenous law, where indigenous law is understood as the legal discourse of indigenous peoples. So we should not simply assume that they're exactly the same. However, much current literature does simply view customary law as embodying the law of indigenous peoples. Finding my way through my notes. So if I turn to reviewing international literature on criminalization, it was really Indian queer activists and associated scholars from the struggle for decriminalization of Section 377 in the Indian Penal Code, who put the issue of the British Empire's criminal legacies on the global agenda for sexuality and gender politics. And the text that definitively did that really was Alok Gupta's report, This Alien Legacy, The Origins of Sodomy Laws in British Colonialism, published in 2008 with contributions from Scott Long, which Ayo has cited in his talk. And this was certainly substantial and rigorous research. And I would say This Alien Legacy emerged as the key synthetic text combining legal detail on criminalization with anti-colonial analysis. It mapped the process of criminalization around the world. However, I want to argue that This Alien Legacy, as this pivotal text, is indicative of a broader problem, which is that the international literature hasn't been addressing customary law. So the report commented, for example, colonial legislators and jurists introduced such laws with no debates or cultural consultations to support colonial control. They believed laws could inculcate European morality into resistant masses. they brought in the legislation, in fact, because they thought native cultures did not punish perverse sex enough. The colonized needed compulsory re-education in sexual mores. So these are the kind of comments that Ayo has just been citing and echoing in his talk. And clearly this was a very important intervention, and it raised very important issues. But the point I want to make is that customary law is missing from this narrative. So I want to suggest that there's a need to keep somewhat open for further analysis certain issues about the differing intentions of colonial authorities, especially at different times within the history of empire, and questions about the scope and forms of application of laws in relation to customary law. So customary law really emerged, as Ayo mentioned, originating as a sort of widespread discourse with Frederick Lugard in Nigeria at the close of the 19th century. And following the scramble for Africa, including the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 that assigned territories among European powers, customary law emerged in the early 20th century as a central feature of British governance and criminal justice. This was reflected in divisions between high-level courts and so-called native tribunals, although, quote, native tribunals were typically administered with involvement of imperial officials and thus were characterized by what Homi Bhabha would call hybridity. And I think Foucault's concept of governmentality may be a useful concept in its broadest sense to describe how various colonial practices were used to influence conduct of subjects. And within this, British colonialism can be seen as developing an overall mode of governmentality that institutionalized significantly different practices of regulation for those colonizing and for different groups among the colonized. So what I find striking in the literature is that it's not only this alien legacy that doesn't cover this issue of customary law, it's also just about all the other contributions from various perspectives. So, for example, in the mainstream legal literature, for example, Michael Kirby, the former Justice of the High Court in Australia, who's been a key legal scholar in the Commonwealth context in relation to LGBT rights, has not focused on customary law in his publications, nor has Andrew Novak, who is leading current legal scholar who has been focusing on decriminalization contestations, and nor has Paula Gerber from Australia, another key law scholar in the Commonwealth context. And we can also see that in the key report that is a very important reference point for the global LGBT movement, ILGA's report, State-Sponsored Homophobia, that is published annually. The methodology of that report, which I analyze in my paper, systematically neglects the issue of customary law. Customary law is sort of mentioned in one or two specific states, but it's not a systematic focus of analysis in the report as a whole. But I would also say that this issue of customary law hasn't been discussed in a lot of the current decolonizing and decolonial literatures. So indicatively, in the volume Decolonising Sexualities, edited by Bakshi, Jivraj and Pozzocco, it's not mentioned. So I think generally in relation to all these different perspectives in the literature, this is a neglected issue. So I decided to investigate this issue. So as a methodology to investigate customary law, I decided to investigate colonial reports documenting such law in a particular former colonial territory. And I chose Kenya to look at. Kenya has the obvious advantage for this of including a large number of different ethnic groups, which suggested the possibility that there might be various different forms of customary law where sources might be found. So essentially, I did a literature review searching for reports on customary law in London libraries, so starting in the British Library and also looking in the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, British Library of Political and Economic Science, and checking the library catalogue of SOAS. So I found a number of different reports and did a kind of thematic analysis to essentially look for what they say about regulation of same-sex sexual acts or gender diversity. I found a guide to customary law in Kenya in the work of a former UK judge called Eugene Cochrane, whose work really sort of emphasized when he published comments on this in 1963 and also 1983, that Kenya had a typically dual system where different forms of law existed and were practiced in relation to what were called native tribunals. So among the a number of different reports that I found, three of them directly referred to the regulation of same-sex sexual offences. So, and it's just important to understand that these reports were produced by a British legal scholar engaging in conversation with leading representatives of particular ethnic groups who were typically involved in the practice of these so-called native tribunals. So there's various methodological problems with these sources of evidence, issues of translation and interpretation are inherent, but nevertheless, they make some interesting comments. So I'll describe the content of these three reports. In 1951, Penwill produced a study of customary law of the Kamba people, and chapter 7 of this covers issues including unnatural behavior, and states, if a man commits an unnatural offence with a young boy, he must pay over a goat and a bull. If two men commit the offence together, each must pay a goat. Such cases are rare. They're normally settled quietly in the locations without ever coming to the courts. Secondly, a study of the Nandi people's customary law was published by Snell a few years later in 1954. And Snell stated that he had received ready cooperation of chiefs and elders from the Nandi people. And in a section called Unnatural Offences, it states, an offender caught in the act could be killed. Otherwise, he would be beaten and by members of his age grade, or in a serious case, would be cursed by the Coquette elders and held in social ridicule. So in that instance, there seemed to be a wide range of possible punishments. And thirdly, a study of the Luo people's customary law by Wilson was published in 1961. And a section of this report makes comments related to same-sex sexual acts, stating that acts which traditionally carried the sanction of banishment enforced by the elders were incest, sodomy, bestiality, homosexuality, as well as premeditated murder or witchcraft. So in this instance, it's clear that Wilson is using Anglophone English language concepts of homosexuality and sodomy to translate understandings from Indigenous understandings. So if we compare those three different reports for three different ethnic groups, we can see that the punishments vary quite significantly from, on the one hand, being killed to banishment to lesser sanctions such as the payment of a goat. I think Alan Masosa's recent research in Malawi suggests possibilities of mistranslation where questions about male same-sex behavior in Masosa's research were found to sometimes be interpreted as referring to behavior between adult men and boys. So that is one example of where there might be mistranslations going on. However, my interpretation would be that the presence of this evidence in three different cases suggests that there was some forms of regulation of same-sex activity that were significant. So overall, what this shows is that there do appear to have been forms of criminalization of same-sex sexual acts between males, although not between females, outside colonial regulation. And so this somewhat challenges areas of the international literature which present same-sex sexual acts only arriving with British colonialism, criminalization of same-sex sexual acts. So clearly this is only a very small study. The findings need to be explored in relation to further research and further investigation. In relation to the literature in Kenya, I would just say that I have done a systematic search of social science literature, social science academic literature in relation to Kenya, and haven't found material on this. In relation to the legal literature, I think there's scope for me to look further, but the work of Seth Machuma Wekesa is relevant, including a chapter called Decriminalization of Homosexuality in Kenya, the Prospects and Challenges, which was published in 2017 when he was a lecturer in law in the School of Law at the University of Nairobi. And in that chapter, Wekesa claimed that there was no law criminalizing same-sex acts before colonialism because such conduct was not deemed worthy of formal legal sanction, but doesn't really provide any reference or evidence to support that. So I think this material does seem to be offering something new, even in relation to the existing Kenyan literature. I'm conscious I need to wrap up, Mónica, so I will do that just by turning to my conclusions. So the neglect of customary law in narratives of colonial criminalization poses important questions about need to revise these narratives somewhat. The findings from Kenya clearly demonstrate that customary law held a defined legal status in the overall legal system, and that there is evidence of specific laws applying to same-sex sexual acts between men. Although there are problematic issues of translation and interpretation to keep in mind, I do think what I've presented to you today does pose questions about whether there's been a problematic tendency for LGBT actors globally in activism and research from perhaps both North and South to collectively construct and adhere to a discourse of colonial criminalization that has systematically downplayed the existence of customary law. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matthew. We have around 20 minutes for our discussion and questions. So if I can ask Kim and Matthew and Ayo to have a look at the chat, there are some questions there. And we can start with the first one for Kim from Julieta. So it's basically, would like to hear your thoughts on how reproduction is entangled with the web of relation that constitutes sexuality, land tenure, and nature. Would you like to start, Kim? I mean, let's try to, just think we have short time, but let's keep, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. It's a good question. And one of the projects in my book is going to be working with Dakota language speakers, at least, because it's my own people and I have access to a lot of different speakers. It's kind of a case study around, I mean, the word mother is a terrible translation for what we mean. So let's start with that. I think if mother is narrowed from what it means in Dakota to what it means in English, in Dakota, these are terrible words, it's the biological mother plus all her sisters. That's mother. So you can see if you narrow it from that to an individual who must produce a child in order to be a mother, that what you're doing then is individualizing and you're making relationships vertical that were more horizontal forms of caretaking. You are requiring that if anybody is going to occupy that category, that they produce a biological offspring. You're doing all kinds of compulsory things. You're also you're investing moral authority in the concept of motherhood that is probably quite different. At least it's different as I've seen it in practice. And that's I would say, an eclipsed practice given the imposition of colonial family. So reproduction might be a good lens into opening space and figuring out, but I would really prefer to theorize those things out of Dakota language. And so it is a great question, and thank you for that. And I will be paying attention to that and what other kinds of ways we can find to talk about that in the next chapter of this book. So that's a beginning of an answer. And also that children, like women and land, become property of men in this framework. And it's not the same in our sort of collective web of relations that include both humans and non-humans as kin. Anyway, that's a beginning of an answer. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. So there's another question now for both Kim and Ayo about saying, you speak about two ways of disrupting settler projects and decolonizing sexualities through relations and through law. Can they go together? Can they help each other, or are they contradictory? For example, if the law itself is part of the colonial project. So maybe Ayo, would you like to start?
Thank you very much, Monica. So I think there's an expression I once heard, I can't recall where from now, that says that we would stand outside the courtroom with placards or something protesting the entire system, while also being inside the courtroom arguing in front of the judges, something like that. So essentially, it's an acknowledgement of how deeply flawed legal systems often are, and yet at the same time, why we still have to engage them in certain respects. Yes, of course, in a lot of legacy colonial legal systems, we find that the understanding of law itself is structured around this Victorian era hegemonic values, from the construction of the state to the construction of society to the idea that people are, subservient to the state, or to the idea that, whatever does not conform to the values of the state is in itself a threat against the state and should be excised. So the entire legal system, whether it is in the area of family law, whether it's in the area of criminal law, whether it's in even constitutional law, is permeated with these ideas. And so for someone like me, I am very critical of using those laws as systems of, engaging the issues, because what often happens more than not is that we only end up with legal reform rather than social transformation. The laws may change in one or two ways that might help people who are already privileged in some ways. So for example, as you have in the US, gay people may get to marry, especially they are white middle class gay people. But when it comes to the other ways in which the legal system is problematic, those law reforms would not help poor people, it will not help people of color, it will not help people who do not generally have the privileges that all these other people tend to have. So from that perspective, I believe more in a reconstruction of the state itself, first and foremost. I believe that because these issues intersect, our energy should be driven towards wider systems of political control of the ways the political system is targeted or is designed to exclude some and include only a few. So for me, if we can get around to a sort of democracy project with foundations of social justice and human rights, then from that point, you can begin to reconstruct legal systems and the moral values that they embed. So yes, it's a kind of disruptive response. I do not think that law is sufficient. I think we need to recreate the state in the ways that represent values that we hold dear now, rather than simply trying to work within the system that the state itself has created.
Thank you, Ayo. Kim, do you have anything to add to this?
Just very briefly, I'm not a legal scholar, so being a lay Indigenous person, certainly we have quote unquote customary law, or we would maybe call it Indigenous law over here, but we also have plenty of bureaucratic tribal legal systems. We have tribal courts. Cherokee Nation has its own Supreme Court. The question was, can they go together or they contradict? I mean, you don't get to you're living inside of a colonial edifice, right? And I think I'm overlapping with what Ayo said in the beginning, that you both strike blows at that edifice while also strategically working within it. So, we have Indigenous thinkers that work through those bureaucratic very settler imposed or co-constituted courts. And we also have people that are pushing Indigenous law as well. And sometimes they come into conflict. So with the kind of land defenders and water defenders in North America, you sometimes have traditional leadership saying, no, we don't want this particular development project. And you have tribally elected or band elected leadership saying, yes, we're all for that kind of capitalist development. So sometimes they do come into conflict. I do think what they share is a desire to displace settler authority wherever possible. And a lot of times that looks compromised. But again, there's no way to live outside of a colonial system. You strike blows within it, I think. I'm curious to hear if others have more liberatory ideas about that than I do, though.
Yeah, thank you. Matthew, I don't know if you have anything to add to this point. Should we move on?
I think No, not particularly at this point. I'm listening, and it's interesting.
Okay.
I mean, I think within the legal discourse, obviously, in terms of human rights, there's things like the Convention on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which sort of comes in from an international level, I suppose. So I'd be interested if Kim had any thoughts on that.
Oh, on like global indigenous kind of thought on UN kind of, no, I don't work at that level. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. So another question for the three of you, which I'm just going to read the last part because it's a bit long. So, but I'm really interested in, from your perspective of all of you, how we can break down, redefine, or even eradicate our ideas of morality, especially when our current imposed morality is completely inadequate for expression and equity. I don't know if Matthew would like to start us on this one.
Can you just repeat the question?
How can we break down, redefine, or even eradicate our ideas of morality, especially when our current imposed morality is completely inadequate for expression and equity? Does it make sense?
Yes.
We had a big preface before, but I just cut to the...
It's such a huge question.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I'll quickly say that I think we're all trying to do that in our own small ways, and I'll hand it over to the other two speakers too.
Okay. It could be just some brief reflection, really. Do you want to go?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm a big believer in, I mean, you can say this is a chicken and egg thing. What comes first, change or the narrative? I think we can't find new ways to live without changing the stories about how we do and should live in the world. So storytelling is really important. And it's not only writers or fiction writers that tell stories, or traditional knowledge holders that tell stories, scientists tell stories. We all tell stories about the way the world is and the way it should be. And until we can tell a different kind of story that's not about global superpowers, that's not about binarism in all of its forms and manifestations, we're not going to be able to live outside of that, I think. And so this is why I'm really interested in, again, digging into indigenous languages and looking at what's reflected there. Now, of course, there's such terrible colonial impositions culturally, linguistically into those languages, and we have lost a lot, I think. But I do think we continue to live in ways that in part manifest the kinds of indigenous ontologies that our ancestors were coming out of. So anyway, for me, it's storytelling is very, very important, or narrating the world in a different way. I think it makes a big difference for people. At least I've been told that in my own work, like, oh, I've had these feelings, like about the non-monogamy stuff I do. I've had these feelings, but I didn't know that's what I was feeling. Now I have words to put to it. And that's been really important for people, to have words and frameworks for reassessing how they live and how they might live in alternative ways.
Ayo, do you want to add something?
Well, like Matthew has noted, this is a very huge question which has a lot of nuances to it. And I think for those of us who live in, this part of the world where a lot of indigenous systems are practically, or norms have been erased, and we are, even imperfectly substituted with these values that came with colonialism, from ideas of individualism, or, taking yourself by the bootstrap and all of that. You can do it if you try. You don't need anybody except yourself. All these values, and then the way that they are at the same time non-inclusive of the different ways in which people want to do their things individually. So we basically live in a fractured normative system. It's neither connected to the past, nor does it engage with the realities of the present. And so it's so hard thinking about how to reconstruct the values that are being shattered in so many ways. What I have been doing at the community organizing level, and what I tell people who attend the public education system, public classes that I conduct in Nigeria, is that I tell them, look, I have adopted a human rights approach to a lot of these issues. the human rights system, especially the global human rights system, is not perfect. A lot of these processes are still very inadequate, and its origins and sometimes its norms can still be very Eurocentric. But overall, it's still a much more better value system than a lot of what we now have people promoting, from ideologies that were battered in 17th century, 18th century industrial Europe, to religious ideologies, to some cultural ideologies that haven't yet evolved to meet present day reality. So I just said, look, instead of trying to decide on one particular normative value or one normative system, let's follow one that at least so far has consensus built into it, has universal ideas built into it, and for me that is the human rights approach. So,
question for Matthew. Oh, you wanted to add something, Matthew, but there's...
Can I just add in a brief comment to the conversation, which would just be in relation to Kim's really interesting discussion about relationality. I just wanted to sort of comment that I think sort of social theory and critical theory have really sort of opened up to these kind of perspectives. And for me, the kind of perspective that you were talking about, including your comments on power, in many ways sounded like it echoed Foucault's sort of understanding of power in certain ways. And I'm also sort of conscious that the whole idea of relationality has become very much a sort of focus in contemporary social theory and sociology. So I suppose I think what I'm saying is analytically, in terms of social science and social theory, that there is a big sort of opening up to, and well, I think there has been over several decades in terms of post-structuralism and ways of looking at the world. So I kind of feel like analytically there's a lot of ways to make connections, and the sort of openings are there. It may be more in the sort of practice that is sort of making the connections that may be more difficult.
Okay, so I want to ask him to look at Adrian Davies' long question while I'll ask Matthew one, and then I'll come back to you, Kim. So Matthew, there's also a long question, but I'm just going to read for you the end. How can we see colonial law as not just regulating sexuality through its form and not just its content? Does that make sense to you?
Perhaps it means through its form and not just its content.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I do think we need to see the law in that way, and that may not have come across in my talk, but I would agree that we should sort of think about that.
Yeah.
I mean, the sort of hierarchical modes of doing law and producing law could be seen as embodying certain kind of hierarchical ideas from Eurocentric perspectives. So, I mean, I would agree that we need to sort of try and think through that, and maybe the sort of perspective, what Kim is saying about the role of narratives, the sort of constitutive role of narratives. Some of those analytical perspectives could be applied to the study of law, and I think there's people in socio-legal studies who do that.
Thank you, Matthew. Kim, do you have insights on where there could be openings for scientists to resist and disrupt these extractive doctrines toward better relations with nature and the non-human?
I never have recommendations for like how you go into your workplace in Silicon Valley and change things in the boardroom. You know, I don't know about that, but I went back to the Making Kin with Machines paper, which is available online. And can I just read like a paragraph sort of in response? Yeah. So one of the authors is Lakota and talks about, and many peoples believe that we're star people. And you can take that as a spiritual thing, but literally life comes from the stars. So you can also view this as a kind of a scientific or materialist analysis. So one of these authors is Lakota and is saying, stones are considered ancestors, and they have a whole preface about stars before that. Stones actively speak. They speak through and to humans. Stones see and know. Stones want to help. The agency of stones connects directly to the question of AI. AI is formed not only from code, but from materials of the earth. To remove the concept of AI from its materiality is to sever this connection. Forming a relationship to AI, we form a relationship to the minds and the stones. They are therefore relations. Relations with AI are therefore relations with exploited resources. If we are able to approach this relationship ethically, we must reconsider the ontological status of each of the parts which contribute to AI, all the way back to the minds from which our technologies, material resources emerge. So, I mean, I think there's ways to think about it differently, how that translates into actually getting people to think differently in a racist, capitalist, colonial world. I don't have the answers to that, but, I'd love to talk about it over an hour or two.
So this is a question, and this is our last question for the three of you. Have you encountered a distinct treatment of gender nonconformity in colonial law, or does it get folded under same-sex conduct? This is coming from the YouTube. So if we start with Ayo with this question, and then also just take the opportunity very briefly to say the last thing you want to say apart from answering this question, and then we'll go like that through all of you. Ayo, welcome.
Thank you. So we have these variations in how colonial laws tend to treat issues of gender identity with issues of sexuality. But sexuality which often targets sex between men. It's often this whole unnatural sex acts or sexual acts against the order of nature, which often is interpreted by the judges as sex between men. And it's usually like that. When it comes to identity, it's often around the idea of, how you look that does not present itself in the notion of a respectable human or a respectable member of the state. So it could be like you are dressed in like a vagabond, or you are dressed in clothing by what is called, the opposite sex. That's that kind of terminology. So you see, for example, in the penal code, a man who dresses as a woman or a woman who dresses as a man. And you have to ask, what does it even mean? What are the men's dresses or the women's dresses, in which context, and so on. But anyway, so yes, over time though, by the time we move from the colonial period through to the early parts of our own contemporary period, now the 1990s and so, we see that law enforcement do not make a distinction between the two anymore. For law enforcement, it's the case of, if you walk, if you see a man, they say you are walking like a girl, you are talking like a girl, you are acting like a girl, so therefore you must be gay. Or you are dressed like a woman, so therefore you must be gay. And so all of the whole idea of gender and sexuality are jumbled into this package of, the whole point is you are transgressing, and that's enough for them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ayo. Matthew?
Yeah, on gender nonconformity or diversity, in my methodology, I did look for it in these reports, but didn't really find it. But I think there's a problem with looking at legal sources for that form of regulation, and it may be necessary to look at wider social sources. For anyone who's interested in the criminalization of gender nonconformity, a really key example is the example of Guyana, where the British Empire had a specific law outlawing cross-dressing. And it existed until, I think, 2018 and was then abolished. And so far, that's the only place where I've come across that. And the chapter to look at on that was authored by DeRoy and Baines Henry, which is a chapter called Violence and LGBT Human Rights in Guyana, which is published in the volume Envisioning Global LGBT Human Rights, which is open access online. If anyone wants a reference, drop me an email.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Kim, give us our final words to close this panel.
Well, I don't think I can answer this question because I'm not a legal scholar. So I can say something else.
Yes,
I have a, this is more of a hypothesis, but I think I agree. I think I will come to agree with this. I think identity is a poor substitute for relations. And so it's individualistic. It's my ancestry, my choice, my identity. I'm really more interested in thinking about how we relate together, which provides for the possibility of more fluidity, of change over time and space, of co-becoming together in more fluid ways that allow us to relate more ethically and in caretaking ways with one another if we move away from this category. But I think about it in relationship to indigeneity. I don't think about it in relationship necessarily. I'm not an expert in other forms of identity. That's the one that I'm kind of hypothesizing that idea out of. And so that's what I'll be investigating in the next year. Thank you for the last word.
That is a very good way of opening our minds and horizons and thinking about this. And thank you so much, Kim. We'll be looking forward to reading you and hopefully listening to you again.